This is Space Minds by Space News. In this week's episode of Space Minds, host David Ariosto speaks with Al Tadros, Chief Technology Officer at Redwire, to explore the future of space infrastructure and commercialization. From the growing role of private investment in orbit to breakthroughs in bioprinting and pharmaceuticals in microgravity, Tadros explains why this is one of the most exciting times in the history of space.
Al Tadros, the Chief Technology Officer at Redwire. It is a pleasure to have you on the show.
Great. Thanks, David. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So your role at Redwire is sort of across the board in terms of tech development and commercialization and just sort of like, the nature of a technical culture that you're building there in this, this relatively new commercial era that we've all seen. I say relatively because, we're a decade or two plus here. But I'm just kind of curious, when it comes to Redwire, one of your previous roles was Chief Growth Officer and Executive Vice President of Space Infrastructure, right? And you did something really similar with Maxar in terms of your role as Vice President of Infrastructure and Civil Space Technologies. And I think that's a really good starting point for this conversation, because when we talk about space infrastructure, what exactly are we referring to?
Right. Great question. And first, I think it's one of the most exciting, if not the most exciting time ever in the space industry. And I'll explain a little bit why and how that relates to the space infrastructure. So a lot of the history in space has been large primes, company that can take on a significant role and oftentimes owns a whole mission area. They will own, missile warning and so forth. The thing about the space industry is that there's so much technology and so many subsystems and capabilities that exist that one company can't be the expert and cost effective on everything at once. So space infrastructure is a lot of the capabilities that go into a mission, whether it's propulsion and structure, avionics, power systems, and solar arrays. There's a lot of components, subsystems, and technologies that go into missions, but those can be applied to different missions. So that's what Redwire really was formed around, the acquisition and integration of capabilities that provide infrastructure, the subsystems, the platforms, the manufacturing capability, the scaling for multiple missions, and not just one specific weather or comms or missile warning or and so forth. So that's what Redwire was really formed, and it's a great introduction that you gave. One of the roles that I had the pleasure of is the supporting the M&A that Redwire used. So it isn't just the technologies or just the capabilities that we put together, but it is through an M&A that we are growing that capability and scaling it. And that's one of the pleasures of my new role at Redwire that was in addition to what I had done before in my prior roles.
Yeah. So, I think, taking a step back and kind of when you look at sort of the broader industry, space has always been sort of the purview of governments, nation states. And, when you look at the space race, this is NASA versus, the old Soviet program that later sort of developed into Roscosmos and other factors. And you still have that to some extent with sort of the Chinese aspect of this. And that seems to be part of the geopolitical factors driving a lot of this. But at the same time, what I find most interesting about Redwire and companies like Redwire is you're looking for things that aren't necessarily taxpayer funded in terms of the pharmaceutical development and orbital services and just the nature of this. I've heard almost described as this like new factory floor in lower Earth orbit. And I wonder if you can kind of unpack that a little bit for me.
Yeah. Well, like I said, it's some of the most exciting times for good reason. First of all, access to space. I mean, as you said, space used to be the purview of governments. And that was largely because just access to space was so rare and so expensive.
Yeah.
And the launch vehicles were nation-owned launch vehicles. More recently, the cost of launch, the frequency of launch, the access, it became almost like a consumer acquirable capability, right?
Right.
High net worth individual and a startup could go off and buy, a slot on a launch
A
vehicle.
nonprofit or a university or anything of this sort.
So all of a sudden it opens up to what's the realm of the possible here from the economics perspective. And a VC didn't have to guess whether they can fund somebody to go to space. They knew that there was going to be a transporter mission or electron, going up, and they can buy it, and they knew the price, commercially set prices and the frequency and so forth. So that really opened up the economy for private investors and companies to consider going into markets like that. In fact, I was just talking to our team about a researcher in economics department at Oxford University who is studying just generally early stage markets. And he started looking at space, in the early stage markets of space, free markets, not government funded. So there's even a broader research kind of community looking at these markets and how they're evolving and how they can be spurred on by government co-investment, but by private investment as well. So it's a exciting time from that perspective for sure.
I wonder though, I wonder in that context, yes, you see like this explosion of commercial technologies and explosion of new companies that are entering the space and individuals and nonprofits and universities, but at the same time, there seems to be this sort of like space 2.0 commercial sector that's kind of developing here in terms of the consolidation effect, right? Like you have some of these major players who have gotten the real estate that they want already, which is kind of a wild kind of concept in the sense that like this is no longer really new. And so that consolidating factor, I wonder how that plays into sort of broader strategy for Redwire, but also sort of the nature of competitiveness when it comes to low Earth orbit
Yeah.
and some of these new exploratory realms like cislunar space and even a lunar services market.
So as you mentioned earlier, part of my background was many years at Space Systems Loral or Maxar, and the focus there was actually what I consider some of the original commercial space, which is geocommunication satellites. And by
Yeah,
commercial, I literally mean these are, private companies, publicly traded companies that generated revenue off of communications services, subscriptions to enterprise users, individual users that fed into buying new satellites, new launch vehicles, ground systems, and services. So that whole economy is where I kind of grew
yeah,
into.
those are your
And
roots in a way. Yeah,
no, you understand very clearly the pragmatic nature of it, the regulatory, the insurance, the operations costs,
yeah,
the color of money that is very different from how the government does things with taxpayer funded activities. So I bring that into my thinking and our thinking at Redwire with regards to the pragmatism of someone wanting to, the popular term here in Silicon Valley where I live is disrupt this and disrupt that. Well, there's a lot of details and history and people trying to do that. And understanding those nuances is really important if you want to be a successful and a sustainable business, not just the cool technologies, which there are plenty of, and the cool pictures of rockets lighting up, which is the plenty of. It's the real pragmatic business aspects that matter. And so, yes, there is more access to space now, and there are more opportunities for investors. But then there's the real detailed business and aspects of running a company, regardless of what
sure.
it is, that we have to understand and consider and work in parallel with all the other cool space stuff that we do. And I think that's one of the things that Redwire really does well is think about things from a business perspective, like you mentioned, and be thoughtful about how do we sustain our business, not just how do we push technologies or push the envelope on different capabilities.
Well, you mentioned Silicon Valley, and I think this is like a natural segue in terms of this conversation because when you look at the space industry, you see a lot of the heads of major space companies, Elon Musk, SpaceX, Jeff Bezos, and with Blue Origin, Eric Schmidt, now at Relativity.
Yeah.
These are all individuals who had a software background in some capacities, right? And so it's almost like there's this nexus and this convergence that we actually did see during the Apollo era, and it's kind of coming around again. And I guess I wonder in that context, this iteration of the industry in terms of developing that factory floor, that infrastructure that we're talking about, where is that balance between the software and the hardware now? Because, we're talking about orbital data, on orbit, just taking advantage of sort of those natural cooling sinks and the constant power of the sun. We're talking about sort of orbital services, talking about storage. All of these things that might have been sort of terrestrial concerns are start migrating a bit into space. And I wonder for a company like Redwire, how you kind of think about that in terms of traditional hardware, which has been associated with infrastructure in space in the past, and this evolution with software.
Yeah, yeah. So first of all, I think it's always been. I mean, I've been in the industry 35 years, and going back to the original kind of cell phone industry, the Craig McCaws of the industry and so forth. It's always been a desire to expand the markets, the terrestrial markets,
Yeah.
by using space capabilities. I mentioned space satellite communications. I mean, that was one of the earliest commercialization of space capabilities and geosatellites, but also things like ICO, Teledesic, Globalstar, and Iridium. Those were the original throes of how can we expand, and it's been some of the high net worth individuals and large successes. So it continues to be a real interest and focus for Redwire to partner with terrestrial industries, whether it's pharmaceuticals or biotech, telecom, even the warfighters, to not have space as a unique, exquisite domain, but as part of that ecosystem. So thinking of biomed as, space is one aspect of it, not the focal point. And
Yeah.
what can you do in microgravity to augment your research, on for bioprinting or crystal growth for pharmaceuticals.
The
Um,
bioprinting aspect I find just wild. I really do. I think that is such a neat kind of aspect of all of this in terms of what you
it
can
is.
do in space and how these lattices kind of develop in ways that sort of mimic, processes within the human body that you just can't do terrestrially. It just that to me strikes me as an opportunity where there's a market that already exists. That you're not like creating new markets, but you're
Exactly.
you're, you're
Exactly.
yeah,
Exactly. And that's the case in all of these. There's already billions of dollars being invested in pharmaceuticals for crystal growth and for medication research. So and yes, what we want to do is be part of that, not create some unique space unique kind of thing. What Redwire does is facilitate it. It is different to operate in space. First of all, you have to survive launch. People
yeah.
think about space as being this light touch, free floating, zero G. Well,
Just
to
the
get
rattling
there,
effect of getting up there. Yeah,
yeah, it's pretty jarring. Acoustics, vibration,
yeah.
vacuum. If you're going into the vacuum of space. So there's a lot of engineering technology to survive launch and then to operate in space, and then if you're going to recover, the reentry and landing and then recovery. So there's a lot of elements there that we work with terrestrial industries, like I mentioned, to expand their research envelope and be able to consider then microgravity as part of the envelope of research. And yes, just thinking scientists, I mean, of course, naturally have lived in 1G. Their research has been in 1G. Buoyancy has been affected by 1G, thermal, and everything has been 1G. So this adds a whole new dimension to
Yeah.
the realm of possible. And like you said, bioprinting in microgravity, all of a sudden you don't need scaffolding, you don't need stiffeners, you don't need to
Right.
think about, okay, how do I make a 3D structure like that? All of a sudden, the lack of gravity helps you at least solve that problem. And then
Pro-
we, Redwire, are working to, address all the other challenges that get you to space.
Producing it seems like the low-hanging fruit. It's getting its market at a level that is still sort of a bottom line
Yeah,
positive type of approach. That to me is the tricky aspect of this because I mean, there's all this talk about helium-3 on the moon. There's all this talk about all these resources that are in space, but
yeah.
until you have a sort of a true space for space economy, getting that to market in the U.S. I mean, it's cheaper now, no question, but it's not that cheap.
No, no, it isn't. And yeah, I mean, you know, it's just a matter of time horizons. So
Sure,
it is
sure,
getting
sure.
cheaper, but if you're looking at investing in the next 2 to 3 years for a return, you
Yeah.
might not want to, depend on resource return from the lunar surface. Uh, Leo you do start to see some potential to have regular up mass and down mass launch and recovery
Hmm.
materials. And some of the markets like crystal growth, which we've done and talked quite a bit about, you don't need to bring a whole lot back. The seed crystals for pharmaceuticals are sufficient to actually start a whole line of new medications, and
Yeah.
we've already demonstrated that. So those are some of the probably some of the earliest successes that we'll see is things like bioprinting and pharmaceuticals, one time up and back kind of activities. But yes, look, I lived most of my career where launches of maybe 10 a year was just outstanding, and
Right.
now we're launching 100, 200 times a year.
Yeah.
So the up mass and down mass already is unbelievably increased tempo, and hence I think that the economic viability is near term for a lot of what we're looking at.
I think to that point, I think it's telling. So I have some colleagues who are photographers that work, as freelancers for NASA, and they used to be at every launch, covering every single one, multiple angles.
Yeah,
And the majority of them they don't even cover now. They don't even
yeah,
just shoot
that's
because
right.
it's so frequent. I won't say it's the level of commercial air travel yet, but I mean that seems to be far away. I know that Mr. Musk has talked about that in some capacities. But you
That's right.
mentioned something earlier I'd be remiss if I didn't dig in on, and it was the nature of warfighters. And I kind of wonder in the context of Redwire how you balance the two, because clearly that is a steady and growing market. Golden Dome is still what everyone seems to be talking about in terms of growth. It's somewhat ill-defined in terms of the scope of it, but clearly has to do with hypersonics, surveillance, tracking, detection, all of these things. But for a company like Redwire, how you marry the focus on building infrastructure that serves civil, commercial, and national security needs all at once, that sort of dual use structures, and how that presents both opportunities and maybe even challenges when you're going overseas and you're looking at other markets in terms of developing these things. Because it's, I just would imagine there's a natural symbiosis with a lot of this technology, and there's a natural growth strategy that's associated with it. But how you scale beyond that when those concerns of national security sometimes may or may not jive with the international competitors that you're dealing with.
Yeah. So yeah, the space industry by its nature has been, grew out of a lot of the Cold War activities, has been a government, focus for national kind of dominance, prestige, human space flight, very much the same. The ability to take humans and sustain them in space is a symbol of national prestige and capabilities.
Yeah.
And so
The
and like
box
I
checking
said,
exercise in some terms of some of this stuff, in terms of like whether or not you're a true space power. You have to you have
yes,
to you have to do a
yeah,
certain amount of things, like the Chinese planting a flag on the moon and that
yeah.
sort of thing.
Yeah. So it isn't all about national security isn't all about just weapons and the defense. It is literally how you behave in space, how you invest in space. It's an indication of your prowess and capability, and quite frankly, it's a deterrence at that point, right?
Yeah.
To others, being aggressive. So that has been a priority for the nation. And like I mentioned earlier, a lot of space is just getting to space. So building capabilities, and that's something that Redwire has a forte in, is understanding the requirements, the environments, the ability to survive launch and survive space environments. So whether it's an optical system for a missile warning, missile tracking system, or a biological experiment we're taking up, those kind of same engineering skills and can be applied. But
Yeah.
yes, we do have a legacy through acquisitions and working with national defense, and we do have a history in working with the government on national security missions, and that is one of our. By the way, Golden Dome is the name that's applied now most recently to a lot of capabilities that
Yeah.
have been worked on. So for people's awareness, this isn't like something new that all of a sudden is
Sure.
looked at. There are a lot of pieces that the nation has been looking at, including space-based interceptors and missile warning, missile tracking. One of the things that we're very passionate about is joint domain operations. Space, again, is not isolated and exquisite. It is part of a warfighting capability combined with air and ground and marine. So we think of it in that way, and we were operating, in that way.
I wonder though, I wonder in the context of that, right? Because we have so many different companies that are starting to operate on orbit. You have, competitors, geopolitical competitors, namely Beijing, to a lesser extent Russia, and to some extent North Korea and Iran even, that are sort of exploring space-based capabilities. Clearly hypersonics is a big priority for all of those nations, but the real teeth of the governing structure was a treaty that was signed 2 years before the Apollo moon landing in 67, right? And so it seems that there have been other treaties over the course of the years, but that's the big one, the Outer Space Treaty of 67, right? And I've heard it described by those that the commercial sector is actually maybe an arena that can start to sort of pave the way in terms of some of these new norms. And yet at the same time, there is not sort of a universally agreed upon structure or a series of regulations that everyone sort of adheres to when it comes to space, namely when it comes to interactions with Beijing. And I wonder from your perspective whether companies like Redwire can kind of establish almost a fait accompli when it comes to some of this by operating in there and doing the kind of business that you're doing, so much so that it becomes sort of an accepted norm and practice that maybe at some point later on becomes institutionalized.
Yeah, yeah. Um, well, I hadn't thought about this before, but from 67 till the first launch of the shuttle was only 13 years. And the vision of the shuttle program, which was started, a few years after, the Apollo program ended in 71 or 72. Um, the vision was it was going to be shuttling things up. It was going to be shuttling humans up. It was going to be assembling things and fixing things and so forth. So that treaty was really important because we were about to do all this, in the 80s. And quite frankly, if you look at some of the early shuttle missions, there was a lot going on, including satellite servicing,
Yeah.
repairs, recovery. We were bringing satellites back that were internationally owned commercial satellites. There
Right.
were things going on there that the treaty was very relevant to. And the fact that it's now, whatever, 40 years later, and we were thinking, wow, they were way ahead of their time.
Yeah.
Well, it was expected that a lot of this was going to happen, 30 years ago or more. So yes, the like I started out with, it is some of the most exciting times ever because we are going to the moon and we're going to stay and do things on the moon, and that matters to the treaty and what was envisioned there. We do have private habitats that are being developed for LEO, and that's something that before the ISS, that's unique and capable. We have a lot of satellites being put up, and that's a whole world on its own. Commercial and private satellites that are being launched into cislunar and beyond, which is a whole world. And all these things, have economies around them, government interests, international interests. And yes, the treaties matter now. Okay, how are they being followed or implemented? Who is providing continuing supervision on these? And how do we spur the economy? Because the U.S. does want to retain and continue growing in this regard. So Redwire is, as we were talking about earlier, has a lot of interest and chops in this regard with regards to commercializing and making it a sustainable business ecosystem. And we're proud of that history, over 30-year history of looking at that, including working on shuttle even before station and now on station, and then looking at lunar surface and private habitats as examples going forward. And we want to be part of the policy and regulatory aspects of that as we go forward.
It strikes me, I mean, even if you're outside the industry, it'd be hard not to kind of look at what's going on, even just by reading the headlines casually and thinking This is the beginning of something. This is the beginning of something that's markedly different and perhaps unprecedented in terms like the history of our species, even in terms of the fanning out beyond the terrestrial confines that has been Earth. I wonder, and this maybe just be our last question here because we're sort of wrapping up with time, but I wonder how you got into this. Like where did space factor into your own personal journey? Was this just like something that you were always about as a kid, like looking up at the stars or watching the Apollo program, or what? Where's this derived?
Yeah, yeah. Good question. Well, I grew up. My dad was an engineer. I grew up around the engineering thinking, and that was one element of it. But quite frankly, I was right at the end of Apollo and before shuttle. But as a freshman in high school, space shuttle launched for the first time, and it was a big influence for me. It was spectacular. It was like out of sci-fi type of stuff to see something go up and then land on wheels at a runway
Yeah.
with nuts coming out. I mean, it was in 1980. It was a bit surreal. So that was a huge influence, and then NASA had a lot of programs for high school students to get involved and so forth. And I entered some of those competitions, and that influenced me. So I kind of it's maybe a little
You
bit
didn't have a
rare,
choice.
but straight out of freshman sophomore year of high school. This is back when I had to go to the library to get space news or aviation week at the time type of magazines to read about and look at. But those kind of things influenced me quite a bit, and I stuck to it. And I ended up going to college in aerospace engineering, and a lot of what the research was I did in grad school and engineering was thinking about what we were going to do in the shuttle bays and building things in space and so forth. So that did influence me, and I'm fortunate to have worked in the space industry now for 35 years on a whole lot of things. But like I said, it's some of the most exciting times. I'm doing things now like VLEO missions, which I hadn't touched in the last 35 years. So it's and the business aspects of it, acquiring companies and integrating companies, new technologies. So it's been an amazing career arc that I think a lot of people, even joining right now, would be thrilled to be part of. So I'm excited by it, and I'm excited to work with new entrants and like I said, terrestrial industries to make use of space now.
Yeah. It's amazing to me though. There's always really the ripple effects of what happens in our childhood and what we see kind of like, carries out and, the nature of the space industry now almost seems like it's perhaps even more exciting than the 1960s and early 70s in terms of that golden era of what's possible. So, oh,
Absolutely, I believe it is. I believe it is.
Al Tadros is the Chief Technology Officer at Redwire, and it has been just an absolute pleasure chatting with you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, David. Take care.